The night of 16th of January has turned into a bloodbath. Poison is already in the cup, a traitor's dagger is pressing against the emir's throat, and a fleet of 1,000 black sails is closing in on the city walls. In a single heartbeat, the paradise of Al-Andalus has transformed into a living hell, where brother sells brother for Fatimid gold, and magnificent Cordoba is being devoured by fire from within. Abd ar-Rahman III has only hours left. Either his head rolls in front of his own people, or he takes a suicidal gamble that will rewrite human history forever. It is a second before the explosion, a moment before the empire's total collapse, but what he does next will make the entire world tremble in pure terror and awe. You will never believe the price he paid for the right to be called God on earth. The bronze gates of the Alcazar Palace groaned under the weight of 1,000 secrets, but none was as heavy as the parchment clutched in the trembling hand of the vizier. 16th of January 9029 was approaching like a desert storm, and the air in the throne room felt thick with the scent of jasmine and impending slaughter. Abd ar-Rahman III stood by the arched window, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the Guadalquivir River reflected the dying light of a crimson sun. He did not need to read the report to know that the Fatimids of North Africa had already cast their shadow across the sea. Their spies were no longer just shadows in the marketplace. They were vipers coiled within the very silk tapestries of his court. The message from the south was clear. 10 ships had been sighted near the coast, and 3 high-ranking governors in the eastern provinces had stopped mentioning the emir's name in their Friday prayers. This was the opening move of a grand game, a silent invasion of the mind before the steel arrived to claim the land. The silence was shattered by the rhythmic thud of heavy boots. 4 palace guards entered, their faces pale under their iron helmets. Behind them, a man in the tattered robes of a merchant was dragged across the marble floor, his hands stained with a dark, sticky substance. "He was found near the royal kitchens, my lord," the captain of the guard spat, throwing a small glass vial onto the table. It shattered, releasing the pungent, bitter smell of hemlock. Abd ar-Rahman III did not flinch. He turned slowly, his gaze piercing the prisoner like a spear. The assassin's eyes were not filled with fear, but with the burning zeal of the Fatimid Caliphate. "The true prince of believers comes from the east to reclaim what is stolen," the prisoner hissed, his voice a ragged whisper that echoed against the high ceilings. "Your throne is a pile of dry wood, and the fire is already lit. 1,000 daggers are waiting for the signal." The Emir stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his Damascus steel sword. He felt the cold vibration of the metal, a reminder that in this world power was not given. It was seized and held until the fingers bled. He looked at the vizier, a man who had served his father and grandfather, yet even now Abd ar-Rahman searched his eyes for the flicker of betrayal. In Cordoba, loyalty was a currency that devalued faster than copper coins. "The Fatimids believe we are a dying branch of a fallen tree," the emir said, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of a mountain. "They think the distance from Baghdad has made us weak, and our independence has made us vulnerable. They are wrong. We are not a branch. We are the root." He signaled the guards, and the assassin was led away to the dungeons. But the tension in the room did not dissipate. It grew, heavy and suffocating. Suddenly, the palace bells began to toll, a frantic, uneven rhythm that signaled danger from the city streets. A second messenger burst through the doors, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Riots in the Jewish quarter, my lord. Agents of the Mahdi are distributing gold and promising 0 taxes to anyone who rises against the palace. 2 barracks have already been set on fire." The dynamic shifted instantly. This was no longer a hidden threat. It was a coordinated strike to paralyze the capital. Abd ar-Rahman III knew that if he retreated into the safety of the inner citadel, he would lose the city by dawn. He needed to show the people that the lion of Cordoba still had teeth. He grabbed his white cloak, the symbol of the Umayyad house, and headed for the stables. The transition from the quiet palace to the chaotic streets was like stepping into a furnace. The smell of burning cedar, and the roar of 1,000 angry voices filled the air. 50 loyal cavalrymen followed the Emir as he rode into the heart of the riot. Stones flew from the rooftops, crashing against shields. In the flickering light of the torches, Abd ar-Rahman saw the faces of his subjects, men who had lived in peace under his rule for 17 years, now twisted by the lies of foreign agitators. At the center of the plaza, a Fatimid orator stood on a fountain, waving a black banner and shouting that the Emir was a puppet of the weak Abbasids in Baghdad. The crowd was 1,000 strong, a sea of white robes and glinting knives. The Emir did not wait for his guards to clear a path. He spurred his horse forward, charging into the center of the mob. The crowd parted, shocked by the sheer audacity of the ruler appearing without a massive army. He stopped 3 paces from the orator. The air was charged with a lethal energy. One wrong move would trigger a massacre. "You speak of a leader across the sea," Abd ar-Rahman shouted, his voice cutting through the din like a clarion call. "But who stands before you now? Who fed you during the 3 years of drought? Who rebuilt the walls when the Christians attacked from the north? I am not a servant of Baghdad, and I am not a victim of the Fatimids." He drew his sword and pointed it at the black banner. The orator reached for a concealed crossbow, his movements quick and practiced, but Abd ar-Rahman was faster. With a single fluid motion, he dismounted and drove his blade through the orator's chest before the man could pull the trigger. The crowd fell into a deathly silence. The blood of the agitator pooled on the white stone of the fountain, one drop at a time. The Emir stood over the body, his breathing steady, his eyes scanning the faces of the rioters. He saw the doubt in their eyes, the fear, and the sudden realization that they were following a ghost against a living king. "Tomorrow," he declared, "the world changes. Tomorrow, Cordoba will no longer look to the east for its soul. We are the center. We are the faith." As he rode back to the palace, the fires were being extinguished, but the true heat was just beginning to rise. In the silence of his study, the Emir looked at the map of the Mediterranean. 2 powers were converging on his home, the dying Caliphate of Baghdad and the rising tide of the Fatimids. To survive, he had to do more than just win a street fight. He had to become something greater than an Emir. He had to reclaim a title that hadn't been held by his family in centuries. The risk was absolute. If he failed, he would be remembered as a heretic and a rebel. If he succeeded, he would change history forever. 16th of January was only 2 days away, and the first move of the Fatimid fleet was already being reported at the port of Almeria. The war for the soul of Al-Andalus had begun. The scent of salt and cedarwood hung heavy over the port of Almeria as the sun dipped below the horizon, but for Abd ar-Rahman III, the sea air brought no peace. A secret dispatch had arrived at 2 a.m., delivered by a rider whose horse had collapsed from exhaustion at the palace gates. The news was a hammer blow. The governor of Gibraltar, a man who had shared bread at the emir's table for 12 years, had opened the southern gates to Fatimid agents. 500 elite North African Berbers had already landed under the cover of a moonless night, seizing the high ground that commanded the straits. This was the dagger in the back that could bleed Al-Andalus dry before the first major battle even began. If Gibraltar fell completely, the gates to the heart of the country would swing wide for the main Fatimid fleet, currently 20 miles off the coast of Africa. "We cannot wait for the army to mobilize," the emir whispered to his trusted commander Al-Nasir as they stood over a map lit by a single flickering candle. "By the time our banners reach the south, the Fatimids will have 5,000 men on those cliffs. We must cut the head off the snake tonight." Abd ar-Rahman III chose 100 of his most loyal Zirid guards, men who had sworn a blood oath to the Umayyad line. They didn't carry heavy shields or shining armor. They dressed in the dark gray of the shadows, armed with short swords and poison throwing knives. The mission was a suicide run, a 60-mile ride through treacherous mountain passes to strike the traitorous governor before he could formalize the handover of the fortress. The ride was a blur of pounding hooves and freezing wind. 4 horses tripped in the rocky ravines, their riders left behind to walk as the emir refused to slow down. Every minute was a grain of sand slipping through a broken hourglass. As they approached the outskirts of Gibraltar, they saw the glow of fires atop the rock. The Fatimid banner, a solid black field that seemed to swallow the light, was already being raised alongside the governor's standard. The betrayal was 100% complete. The emir led his men through a hidden smuggler's path, a narrow fissure in the limestone that led directly to the lower cisterns of the fortress. They moved in total silence, the only sound the dripping of water and the thumping of their own hearts. Suddenly, a torch flickered at the end of the tunnel. Two guards, wearing the distinctive red turbans of the Fatimid vanguard, were patrolling the entrance to the armory. Before they could even draw breath to shout, two black-feathered arrows hissed through the air, finding their marks in the hollows of their throats. Abd ar-Rahman III stepped over the bodies, his eyes cold and focused. He wasn't just a ruler anymore, he was a predator in his own house. They moved through the corridors like ghosts, neutralizing 15 sentries without a single alarm being raised. The dynamic was shifting. The hunters were now inside the walls, but the odds were still 5 to 1 against them. They reached the great hall, where the governor was hosting a feast for the Fatimid commanders. The sound of laughter and the clinking of wine cups drifted through the heavy oak doors. "To the new Caliph of the West," a voice roared from inside, a toast to the enemy. The emir felt a surge of cold fury. He signaled al-Nasir. With a synchronized roar, the 80 remaining loyalists kicked open the doors. The hall exploded into chaos. 200 men scrambled for their weapons as the emir's guards descended like a storm. Tables were overturned, and 10 lamps fell, igniting the expensive carpets. In the center of the carnage, Abd ar-Rahman III locked eyes with the traitorous governor. The governor drew his scimitar, his face twisted in a mask of terror and defiance. "You are too late, Emir," he screamed over the clash of steel. "The 100 ships of the Mahdi are already within sight of the coast. Your head is the price for my new kingdom." He lunged, a desperate, clumsy strike born of fear. The emir parried the blow with a flick of his wrist, the Damascus steel sparking against the governor's blade. They traded 3 rapid blows, the sound like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. On the 4th strike, Abd ar-Rahman stepped inside the governor's guard and drove his blade through the man's golden breastplate. The traitor gasped, his eyes widening as the life faded from them. Zero mercy was shown, but the reconnection point came fast. Just as the governor fell, a horn blasted from the highest tower, a deep, mournful sound that shook the very foundations of the rock. It wasn't a call for help. It was a signal to the fleet. Outside the windows, the horizon was no longer dark. 100 torches burned on the water, moving toward the harbor like a sea of fire. The Fatimid main force had arrived early. The emir looked at his bloodied men. They were exhausted, surrounded by 300 remaining enemies in the lower barracks, and a fleet of thousands was minutes from landing. The scale of the danger had just tripled. "Barricade the gates," Abd ar-Rahman commanded, grabbing a fallen torch. "If we cannot hold the harbor, we will turn this fortress into a lighthouse of death." He knew that if he stayed, he would be trapped. If he fled, the south was lost. Every choice led to a potential massacre. He turned to al-Nasir, a dark plan forming in his mind. "Set the grain stores on fire, all of them. If the Fatimids want this rock, they will find nothing but ash and hunger." As the flames began to roar, the emir realized this wasn't just a battle for a fortress anymore. It was a race to see who would burn first. The smoke from Gibraltar's burning granaries could be seen for 50 miles, but in the marble corridors of Cordoba, a different kind of fire was spreading. While Abd ar-Rahman III fought on the southern cliffs, a deadlier poison had reached the great mosque. 7 high-ranking clerics, bribed with North African gold and promised positions of eternal power, had begun to whisper that the Umayyad line had lost the blessing of the heavens. They claimed that the Mahdi from the east was the only true successor to the Prophet, and that any who followed the emir were walking the path to hell. By the time Abd ar-Rahman returned to his capital at 4 a.m., covered in the dust of the road and the blood of traitors, he found a city on the verge of a holy war. 1,000 citizens were gathered in the square, not with cheers, but with a terrifying, heavy silence. The transition from military hero to religious outcast happened in a heartbeat. As the emir approached the palace steps, a wall of black-robed monks blocked his path. Their leader, a man with a beard as white as salt and eyes as hard as flint, held up a scroll bearing bearing the seal of Baghdad. "The Caliph of the East has spoken," the old man cried, his voice echoing off the stone arches. "Abd ar-Rahman is no longer a protector of the faith. He is a rebel who brings the wrath of the sea upon us. To follow him is to invite the destruction of our homes." 0 swords should be raised for a man who has been cast out by the light. The crowd began to surge forward, a low growl of 1,000 voices rising like a tide. Inside the palace, the situation was even worse. 3 of the emir's closest advisors had fled, taking with them the keys to the treasury and the secret codes for the northern frontier. The dynamic had shifted from a defense against invaders to a struggle for the very soul of the nation. Abd ar-Rahman III stood in his private chambers, looking at his reflection in a polished silver mirror. He saw a man who had spent 17 years building a paradise, only to see it torn apart by words and gold. "They use the faith as a shield for their greed," he muttered to al-Nasir, who was cleaning a deep gash on his arm. "If I strike them down, I become a tyrant. If I let them speak, I become a ghost." Suddenly, the windows of the chamber shattered. A heavy stone, wrapped in a burning cloth, landed on the silk rug. Outside, the chants had turned into screams. "Death to the pretender! Bring us the head of the Umayyad!" The reconnection point was sharp and violent. The palace guard, once 100% loyal, was now hesitating. 40 soldiers had already laid down their spears, refusing to fight against the holy men in the square. The emir realized that he was being boxed into a religious cage. The Fatimids hadn't just sent ships, they had sent an ideology that turned his own people into his executioners. He didn't hide, he didn't flee. Instead, he ordered the gates of the palace to be thrown wide open. 12 guards formed a thin line as the emir walked out into the moonlight, unarmed and wearing only a simple white tunic. The shock of his appearance froze the mob. The black-robed clerics stepped forward, their fingers pointed like daggers. "You dare come before us after spilling the blood of your brothers in the south?" the leader hissed. "The Fatimid fleet has taken Almeria. 2,000 men are marching this way. Even the stars have turned against you." This was the peak of the tension. One stone, one shout, and the emir would be torn to pieces. Abd ar-Rahman III took a slow, deliberate step toward the head cleric. He didn't look at the mob. He looked only at the man who had sold his soul. "You speak of the stars," the emir said, his voice quiet but carrying a strange hypnotic power. "But you forget who built the observatories that track them. You speak of the faith, but you forget who built the roofs under which you pray. I did not spill blood for a throne. I spilled it so that your daughters would not be sold in the markets of Cairo." He reached out and grabbed the cleric's hand, forcing it onto his own chest, right over his beating heart. "If the heavens have truly turned against me, let the lightning strike now. But if you are lying for the sake of Fatimid gold, then you are the only heretic here." The silence that followed was 100% absolute. 10 seconds felt like 10 hours. A young boy in the front of the crowd dropped his stone. Then a woman began to weep. The religious trap was failing because it lacked the one thing the emir possessed, the physical presence of a leader who was willing to die. But the victory was short-lived. A sudden flash of light illuminated the southern sky, a massive explosion at the city's secondary armory. The Fatimid agents had used the distraction of the protest to strike the heart of the city's defenses. 1,500 barrels of naphtha had been ignited, and the fire was spreading toward the great mosque. "The temple is burning!" someone screamed. The mob, once paralyzed by the emir's words, now exploded into a frantic, directionless panic. The clerics tried to lead the people toward the gates, intending to open them for the approaching Fatimid vanguard. Abd ar-Rahman III realized that the time for words had ended. The scale of the disaster was reaching its zenith. He turned to his remaining guards, his face like carved granite. "Seal the mosque. Protect the holy ground at all costs, and find the men who lit that fire. I want them hanging from the minarets before the sun rises." As the sky turned a bruised purple with the coming dawn, the emir stood on the balcony, watching his city bleed. He knew that Part 4 would not be fought with speeches, but with the total commitment of every life in Cordoba. The Fatimid army was only 5 miles away, and the smoke from the armory was a signal to the world that the Umayyad era was either about to end in ashes or be forged into something indestructible. He had survived the trap gap, but the battle for the gates was just beginning. The dawn of 14th of January 929 did not bring light, but a thick, suffocating fog of grey ash that drifted from the ruins of the armory. The Fatimid vanguard, 2,000 elite Black Guard infantry, had reached the southern walls of Cordoba, their iron-scaled armor glinting like the skin of a serpent. Inside the city, the chaos was 100% absolute. 3,000 civilians were trapped between the advancing fires and the locked gates, while the Emir's remaining 800 loyalists scrambled to man the battlements. The dynamic had reached a breaking point. The Fatimids weren't just attacking, they were bringing a siege engine of psychological terror. They catapulted 50 severed heads of the Almeria border guards over the walls, each one a grim message that no mercy would be granted to those who stood with the Umayyad. They think our walls are made of paper because our hearts are divided, Abd ar-Rahman III roared, his voice rising above the screams of the wounded. He stood atop the gate of the bridge, his golden armor reflecting the fires below. He had spent the last 2 hours personally barricading the weak points with 500 marble blocks stripped from his own palace gardens. The scale of the threat was staggering. For every one of his soldiers, 4 Fatimid warriors stood outside, bolstered by 10 heavy catapults that had been assembled with terrifying speed. The first 10-pound stone struck the gatehouse with the force of a falling mountain, shaking the earth and sending a shower of splinters into the eyes of the defenders. The reconnection point came when the Fatimids launched their main assault. 100 ladders hit the stone walls simultaneously. The air turned black with 1,000 arrows, a lethal rain that forced the Emir's archers to crouch behind their merlons. Abd ar-Rahman did not hide. He moved from tower to tower, his sword drawn, hacking through the first hands that reached the top of the ramparts. He saw a Fatimid officer, a giant of a man draped in leopard skins, leap onto the wall. With a single calculated strike, the Emir parried a heavy mace and drove his blade into the gap of the giant's visor. 1 down, 1999 to go. The physical intensity was draining. Every muscle in his body screamed, but he knew that if the line broke for even 60 seconds, Cordoba would fall. In the heat of the slaughter, a messenger crawled to the Emir's side, his face smeared with soot. The eastern wall has been breached. 200 Berbers have entered through the sewer grates near the tanneries. This was the moment of maximum danger. The city was being hollowed out from within. Abd ar-Rahman III realized that a standard defense was a slow suicide. He needed a tactical miracle. He turned to al-Nasir and gave an order that seemed like madness. Open the main gates, now. The commander stared in shock, but the Emir's eyes were cold and certain. 10 seconds later, the massive bronze valves of the gate of the bridge groaned open, revealing the blood-soaked plaza to the startled Fatimid army. The Fatimid commanders, sensing a sudden surrender, ordered their heavy cavalry to charge. 500 horses thundered toward the open gap, a tidal wave of muscle and steel. But as they entered the narrow funnel of the gatehouse, they realized they had stepped into a furnace. The Emir had positioned 200 hidden archers in the balconies above, armed with Greek fire, a volatile mixture of naphtha and oil. "Burn them," Abd ar-Rahman commanded. 100 glass jars shattered on the cobblestones, and one single flaming arrow turned the gateway into a literal tunnel of fire. 0 horses could escape the inferno. The screams of the dying cavalry echoed through the city, breaking the morale of the Fatimid infantry still outside. While the fire raged at the gate, the Emir led a countercharge of 100 Zirid guards toward the eastern breach. They caught the 200 Berbers by surprise in the narrow alleys. It was a brutal, claustrophobic meat grinder. 10 men fought in spaces meant for 2. Abd ar-Rahman fought like a man possessed. His white cloak now stained a deep, dark crimson. He used the terrain of his own city against the invaders, leading them into dead ends, where they were pelted with boiling water and stones by the very citizens who had rioted against him the day before. The common people, seeing their Emir bleeding in the mud alongside them, finally found their courage. 1,000 blacksmiths, bakers, and merchants joined the fray, armed with nothing but hammers and cleavers. By 12 p.m. the tide had turned, but the cost was devastating. 400 of the Emir's loyalists lay dead, and 1/3 of the southern district was a smoking ruin. The Fatimids had retreated to their camp, but they were not defeated. They were simply waiting for their second wave of reinforcements. The Emir stood in the center of the bridge, his sword notched and his breathing ragged. He looked at the 100s of bodies clogging the river. He knew he couldn't survive a second day of this. He needed to end the war not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of every man in Al-Andalus. The scale of the conflict had reached its peak. The next 24 hours would determine if the Umayyad name would be erased from the maps. As the sun began to set, casting long skeletal shadows over the battlefield, Abd ar-Rahman III made a decision that would shock both Baghdad and Cairo. He didn't order the walls to be repaired. He didn't call for a retreat. Instead, he ordered his scribes to prepare 1,000 parchments. If the world wanted to challenge his right to rule, he would give them a reason to tremble. He would claim the one title that no one in the West had dared to touch for 200 years. The night of 15th of January was the quietest Cordoba had ever known. A silence heavy with the scent of death and the metallic tang of dried blood. Outside the walls, 4,000 fresh Fatimid reinforcements had arrived, their campfires encircling the city like a crown of thorns. Inside, the great mosque stood as a beacon of white stone in the darkness. Abd ar-Rahman III sat alone in the mihrab, the sacred niche pointing toward Mecca. He was no longer the blood-stained warrior of the bridge. He had bathed, perfumed his hair with agar wood, and donned a robe of pure silk. He had summoned the 10 most powerful tribal leaders and the 5 chief qadis, judges, of Al-Andalus for a final confrontation. The dynamic was no longer about steel. It was a psychological duel for the future of a civilization. The council gathered at 3 a.m. under the flickering light of 1,000 silver lamps. The tension was 100% palpable. These were the men who controlled the lands, the taxes, and the souls of the people. Many had already sent secret letters to the Fatimid camp, preparing to switch sides if the city fell. "The Fatimid Mahdi offers us peace," the oldest sheikh began, his voice trembling. "He offers us protection from the north and a share of the African trade. Why should we die for a title that Baghdad no longer respects? You are an emir, Abd ar-Rahman, but you are not a miracle worker. One day of battle has cost us 1,000 lives. 2 days will cost us everything." The reconnection point came when the emir stood up, his shadow stretching long across the forest of marble columns. He didn't argue about military strategy or trade routes. Instead, he pulled 10 scrolls from his belt, the intercepted letters of the men in the room. He didn't burn them. He handed them back to their owners. "You speak of peace," the emir said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet, "but the Fatimids do not want partners. They want slaves. They do not want to protect the faith. They want to own it. If you open the gates tomorrow, you will not be sheikhs. You will be tax collectors for a master in Cairo who does not know your names." The room went cold as the leaders looked at their own betrayals held in their hands. The scale of the danger shifted from the external walls to the internal hearts of the men. Abd ar-Rahman III walked to the center of the circle. "Baghdad is a ghost. The Abbasids are prisoners in their own palace, puppets of Turkish guards. They cannot protect you. They cannot even protect themselves. For 174 years we have lived as emirs, mere governors of a province that no longer has a center. But look at these walls. Look at the libraries we have built, the 700 baths, the 1,000 books. We are not a province. We are the center." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. This was the ultimatum: total recognition or total collapse. Suddenly, a scout burst into the mosque, breaking the sacred protocol. "The Fatimid commander Ibn Khazar has sent a final message. He gives us until the first light of dawn to surrender the keys to the city. If not, his 5,000 Berbers will burn every house to the ground. They have already started the fires in the suburbs." The pressure reached its zenith. The tribal leaders looked at each other, then at the emir. This was the moment of decision. Would they crawl to a foreign conqueror, or stand with a man who had just shown them their own cowardice? "I will not give them the keys," Abd ar-Rahman III declared, his voice rising to a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mosque. "I will give them a choice. Tomorrow they will not be fighting an emir, they will be fighting a caliph." The word hit the room like a thunderbolt. To claim the caliphate was to claim supreme leadership leadership over the entire Muslim world, a direct challenge to both Baghdad and the Fatimids. It was a move of 100% risk. If the people didn't believe him, he would be executed as a madman. If they did, he would become the most powerful man in the West. One by one, the sheikhs knelt. The realization hit them that there was no middle ground left. The Emir had burned the bridges behind them. They were either the founding fathers of a new empire or the last victims of a fallen house. "We are with you, Prince of the Believers," the oldest sheikh whispered, placing his hand on the Emir's foot. The transition was complete. The political rebellion had become a holy crusade, but the sun was now beginning to touch the horizon, and the Fatimid drums were already beating for the final assault. The Emir turned toward the balcony overlooking the city. 16th of January 929 had arrived. The streets were filling with 1,000s of citizens who had heard the rumors of the Knights' Council. They weren't holding white flags. They were holding the banners of the Umayyads. The final stage was set. The battle for the gates was over, and the birth of the caliphate was about to begin. Every man, woman, and child in Cordoba stood waiting for the one sentence that would change the world forever. Вибачаюсь за неточність у обсязі. Я розширю шосту частину, додавши більше деталей до фінальної битви, описів церемонії та внутрішніх роздумів халіфа, щоб досягти необхідної кількості символів, близько 6000 символів, 1500 слів, зберігаючи при цьому динаміку та структуру. Парт 6. The birth of the caliphate. The dawn of 16th January 929 broke over Cordoba not with the gentle light of a new day, but with a heavy golden glare that seemed to set the Guadalquivir River on fire. The air was thick with the scent of orange blossoms and the metallic tang of 5,000 sharpened blades. Outside the southern walls, the Fatimid army stood in a terrifying, silent formation. They were 5,000 elite warriors, seasoned by the harsh sun of the Sahara and the blood of a dozen North African rebellions. Their commander, Ibn Khazar, sat atop a black stallion that paced nervously in front of the gate of the bridge. He expected a city broken by fear, a people ready to hand over their keys in exchange for their lives. He expected to see a white flag of surrender fluttering from the battlements where the Umayyad banners had once waved. Instead, the massive bronze gates, which had withstood the battering rams of 100 sieges, swung open with a slow, rhythmic groan that echoed like a funeral bell for the old world. Out of the darkness of the gatehouse emerged a sight that froze the Fatimid vanguard in their tracks. It was not a desperate army of ragtag defenders, but a sea of 1,000 horsemen dressed in pure, blinding white silk. At their head rode Abd ar-Rahman III. He was no longer the mud-splattered warrior who had held the bridge 2 days ago. He was a vision of celestial authority, wearing a robe woven from the finest silk of Almeria, his white turban anchored by a single massive ruby that glowed like a drop of dragon's blood in the morning sun. Behind him, the 10 tribal leaders who had plotted his downfall only 24 hours earlier now rode as his honor guard, their faces set in grim masks of loyalty. The dynamic had shifted 100% from a military defense to a grand, ritualistic manifestation of power. This was not a king coming out to fight. It was a god coming out to claim his domain. Abd ar-Rahman III stopped his horse exactly 100 paces from the front line of the Fatimid cavalry. The silence was so absolute that one could hear the leather of the saddles creaking and the distant cry of a falcon circling the heights of the Al-Khazar. The hook of this final confrontation was the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the Emir's presence. He was exposed within range of 1,000 Fatimid archers, yet he sat his horse with a stillness that suggested he was protected by an invisible wall. 0 arrows were fired. The Fatimid soldiers, many of whom were deeply religious, looked at the Emir and then at their own black banners, and for the first time a ripple of doubt passed through their ranks. Was this the man the Mahdi had called a heretic? He looked more like the shadow of the prophet than anyone they had ever seen. The reconnection point of the finale was the legal and spiritual transformation of the state. The chief Qadi of Cordoba, a man whose word was law for millions, stepped forward and unfurled a massive scroll of parchment that trailed to the ground. His voice, amplified by the acoustics of the stone walls and the morning stillness, carried across the field to every soldier, spy, and citizen. "Hear the word of Al-Andalus," he cried. "Today Today, we do not recognize the puppet masters of Baghdad, nor the pretenders who crossed the sea to steal what they did not build. Today, the blood of the Umayyads returns to its true height. Abd ar-Rahman III is no longer just our Emir. He is the prince of the believers. He is the protector of the faith. He is the Caliph of the West. A roar erupted from the city walls. 15,000 voices shouting the new title in a rhythmic, deafening thunder that sent a flock of birds screaming into the sky. Ibn Khazar, realizing that every second of this ceremony was eroding his men's will to fight, ordered a desperate all-out charge. "Kill the pretender!" he screamed, drawing his heavy scimitar and spurring his horse into a gallop. 500 heavy cavalrymen followed him, a tidal wave of iron and dust. But Abd ar-Rahman III did not move. He waited until the Fatimids were close enough to see the whites of their eyes. Then he raised his hand. From the ruins of the southern suburbs, which everyone thought were empty, 2,000 hidden Zirid archers rose like ghosts from the rubble. They had been waiting in the cellars and behind the broken walls for 4 hours. 1,000 arrows hissed through the air in a single perfectly timed volley. The front line of the Fatimid charge simply vanished, horses and men tumbling into the dust in a chaotic heap of broken limbs. The physical intensity of the battle was brief, but 100% decisive. As the Fatimid cavalry struggled to regroup, Abd ar-Rahman III lowered his hand and signaled for his own 1,000 white-clad horsemen to charge. They moved with the precision of a single blade, cutting through the disorganized Fatimid center. The Emir himself was in the thick of it, his Damascus sword flashing like a bolt of lightning. He didn't fight with the rage of a rebel, he fought with the cold, efficient grace of a master. By 11 a.m., the Fatimid black banners were being trampled into the blood-soaked mud. The survivors, seeing their commander fall and their holy mission crumble, broke and fled toward the southern coast, pursued by the very citizens who had rioted against the palace only days before. The transition from war to the birth of an empire was finalized in the Great Mosque. As the afternoon sun cast long purple shadows through the 850 columns of the prayer hall, the new caliph stood before the gathered masses. He had replaced his sword with a golden scepter, and his face was a mask of granite-like resolve. "The dependency on the East is dead," he declared, his voice echoing through the vast space. "We are no longer a branch cut from a tree in Baghdad. We are the root. We are the center of the world's knowledge, the world's faith, and the world's power." Zero doubts remained in the eyes of the people. They had seen the fire, and they had seen the man who walked through it. The scale of this victory would be felt for 500 years. On this day, 16th of January 929, the Cordoba Caliphate was born, a state that would become the most advanced civilization in medieval Europe. The final shock for the audience is the realization that this was not just a victory of swords, but a victory of vision. Abd ar-Rahman III had turned a crumbling province into a global superpower in the span of a single week. As the 1,000 lamps of the mosque were lit for the evening prayer, the new caliph looked out over his city and knew that the golden age had begun. The story ends with a sharp, effectful image. The caliph standing alone on the highest tower of the Al-Khazar, watching the last of the Fatimid ships disappear over the horizon, while behind him the lights of Cordoba burned brighter than the stars.